The arrest that should never have happened. The night was quiet in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. The kind of quiet that stretched through the streets after a long day, when most businesses had closed and only a few people remained outside. The neon lights of upscale shops cast a soft glow on the sidewalks, reflecting off the occasional passing car. Sergeant Linda Carter sat in her patrol car, fingers drumming idly on the steering wheel. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. At least, that's what she told herself. She had been on the force for 12 years, long enough to trust her instincts, long enough to know trouble when she saw it. And then she spotted him. A tall black man, dressed in a crisp charcoal gray suit, walking down the sidewalk with an air of confidence. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hesitating. He just walked like he belonged there. Linda's fingers tightened around the wheel. Something about the way he moved made her uneasy. She flicked on her headlights, illuminating the pavement in front of him as she slowly rolled the car forward. As she pulled up beside him, she lowered her window. "You live around here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. The man turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with a calm, steady expression. His dark eyes showed no fear, only mild curiosity. "Excuse me." His tone was neutral, controlled. Linda didn't like that. "It's a simple question," she said, stepping out of the car. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." That wasn't true, but it was all the justification she needed. The man sighed, his breath slow and deliberate. "I'd like to know what description that is." Linda squared her shoulders. Tall, dark suit, walking in an area that's had recent break-ins. She saw it then, the flicker in his eyes. Not fear, something else. Frustration, disbelief. "I see," he said. "Well, I'd be happy to clarify anything. Do you have probable cause to detain me?" Linda's jaw tightened. His tone, it was too even, too composed. It made her uneasy. She was used to people fumbling over their words, making excuses, trying to explain themselves. But he didn't. "Let's see some ID." The man hesitated, not because he didn't have it, but because he already knew where this was going. And he was right. Before he could reach into his pocket, Linda stepped forward. "Hands where I can see them." He exhaled sharply. "Now, officer, this is unnecessary. Turn around." His shoulders tensed, his entire posture stiffening as if he'd been through this before. He turned slowly, carefully. Linda reached for her cuffs. "Are you arresting me?" he asked. "Turn around," she repeated. He did. And just like that, it was done. But something felt off. No arguing, no shouting, no threats of a lawsuit, just quiet compliance. Like a man who knew this wasn't the end of the story. He was right. And Linda was about to find out just how wrong she had been. Part 2. The Courtroom Reckoning. The hum of voices in the courthouse filled the air as Sergeant Linda Carter adjusted her uniform. She had testified in court many times before, given her account, walked out without a second thought. This was supposed to be another open and shut case, but it wasn't. Across the room, the man she had arrested sat at the defense table. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look rattled, didn't look like a man on trial. And that annoyed her. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, gave Linda a nod before stepping forward. "Sergeant Carter," he began, "can you walk us through the night of the arrest?" She cleared her throat. "I was on patrol around 11 p.m. I noticed the defendant acting suspiciously near several businesses that had reported recent break-ins." The prosecutor nodded. "And what led you to detain him?" "His behavior. He appeared to be surveying the area, taking his time near closed storefronts. I initiated contact, asked for ID, and he refused to comply." The man at the defense table didn't react. He just watched. Then the defense attorney stood, a sharp-looking woman in her late 40s, adjusting her glasses as she flipped through a file. "Sergeant Carter," she said. "Are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment?" Linda felt irritation creep up her neck. "Of course." "Good," the attorney said. "Then you understand that an officer needs reasonable suspicion to detain someone. Can you specify what my client was doing that made him a suspect?" Linda stiffened. "As I said, he was loitering near a high-end shopping area late at night." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "Loitering? Would you say walking is a crime?" Linda exhaled slowly. "It depends on the circumstances." "Right. So let's clarify those circumstances. Did you witness my client attempt to enter any closed businesses?" "No, but did he run, hide, display any behavior that suggested criminal intent?" Linda hesitated. The attorney's voice sharpened. "Sergeant." "No." The courtroom was silent. Linda's grip tightened on the witness stand. "How many people walked down that street that night?" the defense attorney asked. Linda blinked. "I don't have that number." "Did you stop all of them?" "No." "But you stopped him." Silence. The defense attorney let that sit before turning back to the judge. "No further questions. For now." Linda swallowed. This wasn't going the way she expected. And something told her it was about to get worse. Part 3. The Reveal. Linda sat stiffly in the witness chair, her palms pressing into her lap. She was used to courtroom procedures, but this wasn't how things were supposed to go. The defense attorney adjusted her glasses and flipped through her files again. "Sergeant Carter," she said, "you charged my client with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." Linda nodded. "But you just testified that he complied. So how exactly did he resist?" Linda's mouth went dry. "He refused to show ID." The attorney tilted her head. "Is that a crime?" Linda hesitated. "It can be. If an individual is suspected of unlawful activity." "Suspected? Based on what?" Linda clenched her jaw. "His behavior." The attorney sighed and set the file down. "You keep saying that, Sergeant, but let's examine the facts. You had no description of a suspect that matched him. You didn't see him commit a crime. You didn't even witness anything close to illegal behavior. And yet you arrested him." She let the words hang for a moment, then added, "Did you ever stop to consider that he might have just been a man walking home?" Linda's breath caught. The defense attorney took a slow step forward. "Sergeant, when you ran his name through the system, did you find anything? Any warrants? Any priors?" Linda exhaled. "No." The attorney nodded. "Nothing." Silence. Then the man at the defense table stood up. The judge turned to him. "You may proceed." Linda's stomach twisted. Since when did defendants get to proceed? The man adjusted the cuffs of his suit, then turned to her. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "do you remember the night of my arrest?" Linda forced herself to nod. "Do you remember why you said you stopped me?" She gritted her teeth. "Yes." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Interesting," he said, "because I was there that night for a very specific reason." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a badge, and held it up. "My name is Special Agent Daniel Whittaker," he said. Linda's heart stopped. "I'm with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." And in that moment, Linda knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The courtroom unraveling. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, the air thick with the kind of tension that only comes when justice hangs in the balance. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched toward the judge's bench, where that Honorable Judge Ellen Grayson adjusted her glasses, peering down at the assembled attorneys, the jury, and the accused. Sergeant Linda Carter sat stiffly at the witness stand, her posture straight, her uniform crisp. She had been in this position before, testifying against suspects, providing evidence, securing convictions. This was just another day in court, another criminal off the streets, except it wasn't. Across from her, the defendant, Daniel Whittaker, sat at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked collected, too collected. That bothered her. He should be anxious, maybe even regretful. He should be fidgeting, or looking around the courtroom for an escape from whatever sentence was coming his way. But he wasn't. He was sitting calmly, his gaze steady, as if he already knew the outcome. That made her uneasy. The prosecutor, James Holloway, stepped forward, buttoning his dark blue suit jacket as he moved. He was a veteran attorney, known for his methodical approach and meticulous attention to detail. His job today was to solidify the case against Whittaker, to make sure the jury saw the facts for what they were. "Sergeant Carter," Holloway began, offering her a reassuring nod. "Can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Linda cleared her throat and squared her shoulders. "I was on routine patrol in downtown Atlanta," she began, her voice steady. "It was around 11 p.m. when I spotted the defendant walking near a row of high-end stores. Given that there had been multiple break-ins in that area over the past few weeks, I found his presence suspicious." "And what led you to approach him?" Linda chose her words carefully. "His behavior. He appeared to be surveying the area, pausing near certain storefronts for longer than usual. I initiated contact and asked for identification." "And did he comply?" She hesitated for half a second, then said, "No." Holloway nodded. "And at that point, did you have reason to believe he was engaging in criminal activity?" "Yes," Linda replied, glancing toward the jury. "He refused to provide identification when asked, and given the circumstances, I made the decision to detain him for further questioning." The prosecutor stepped back slightly, letting her words settle. The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint scratching of pens as jurors took notes. Then came the moment Linda had been dreading. The defense attorney stood up. Victoria Hayes was a formidable woman, mid-40s, sharp eyes, and a reputation for dismantling weak arguments like a wrecking ball. She adjusted her glasses, flipping open a file as she walked toward the witness stand. "Sergeant Carter," she began, her tone calm but deliberate. "Let's talk about this suspicious behavior." Linda didn't like her tone. Hayes continued. "You said my client was pausing near storefronts." "Yes. And that made you suspect he was a criminal." Linda frowned. "Given the history of break-ins, yes." Hayes gave a small nod. "Interesting. Tell me, Sergeant, do you stop every pedestrian who pauses near a store window at night?" Linda clenched her jaw. "No, but you stopped Mr. Whittaker. He matched the description of a potential suspect." Hayes arched a brow. "Oh, could you clarify what that description was?" Linda hesitated. She felt a flicker of discomfort creep up her spine. "Tall, dark suit, alone at night in a high-crime area." Hayes pressed her lips together as if considering that. "So, the description was a tall man in a dark suit." Linda swallowed. "Yes." Hayes let out a short breath through her nose. "Would you say that's a rather broad description?" Linda's fingers tightened on the edge of the witness stand. "It fit the circumstances," she said tightly. Hayes nodded, then slowly turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear about what happened here," she said, gesturing toward Linda. "An officer saw a well-dressed man walking alone and decided he looked out of place. She had no active suspect description that matched him. She had no report of a crime in progress. She had no evidence whatsoever that he had done anything wrong." She let the silence stretch for a moment before turning back to Linda. "Tell me, Sergeant, would you have stopped him if he were white?" A ripple went through the courtroom. Linda felt her stomach drop. "That's not relevant," she said, but her voice was noticeably tighter. Hayes arched a brow. "Not relevant." She turned to the judge. "Permission to introduce new evidence, Your Honor." Judge Grayson adjusted her glasses. "Proceed." Hayes lifted a file. "This is a statistical review of Sergeant Carter's stop-and-search record over the last 5 years. It shows that over 78% of her stops were black men. The demographic breakdown of her precinct, only 35% black." Linda's breath caught. "Now, Sergeant," Hayes continued, stepping closer, "do you still think race wasn't a factor?" Linda's jaw locked. She couldn't answer. The jury was watching her now. So was the judge. Hayes let the silence settle before flipping to another page in her folder. "And then," she said, after stopping my client, "you arrested him. What were the charges?" "Obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." Hayes lifted a brow. "Did he physically resist?" "No." "Did he run?" "No." "Did he even raise his voice?" Linda inhaled sharply. "No." Hayes shook her head. "So let me get this straight. You stopped a man with no cause, detained him, and then charged him with resisting, when he did nothing but refuse to give in to an unlawful request." Linda opened her mouth but had no response. Hayes exhaled, then turned to the judge. "No further questions. For now." Linda felt cold. Then the defendant stood up. Judge Grayson turned to him. "Mr. Whittaker, you may proceed." Linda frowned. Since when did defendants get to proceed? Whittaker adjusted his cuffs, stepping toward the stand. "Sergeant Carter," he said, voice level. "Do you remember the night of my arrest?" Linda stiffened. "Of course. And you testified, under oath, that you stopped me because you believed I was suspicious." "Yes." Whittaker's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, in knowing. "Interesting," he murmured. Something in Linda's chest tightened. Then, calmly, he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a badge. Not a police badge, a federal one. "My name is Special Agent Daniel Whittaker," he said, holding it up for all to see. A sharp intake of breath filled the courtroom. "I'm with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division," he continued. "For the past 8 months, I have been investigating patterns of racial profiling and unconstitutional policing." Linda's blood ran cold, and in that moment she realized. She had just arrested a federal agent, and he had been waiting for this moment. The truth comes to light. The courtroom was silent. Not the usual kind of silence that came between testimonies, but the kind that held weight, an unnatural stillness, like the pause before an explosion. Sergeant Linda Carter sat frozen in the witness chair, her mind struggling to process what had just been said. Special Agent Daniel Whittaker, Department of Justice. Her heart pounded so loudly that she barely heard the murmurs spreading through the room. She had arrested a federal agent. She had cuffed, detained, and falsely charged a man whose entire job was to investigate officers like her. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was an execution of her career, of her credibility, of everything she thought she controlled. The defense attorney, Victoria Hayes, stood beside Agent Whittaker, arms crossed, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Let's take a moment to let that settle in, shall we?" Hayes said, turning back to the jury. "The man Sergeant Carter arrested wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even a suspect. He was a federal agent investigating her, and she walked right into it." The jury's faces were unreadable, but Linda could feel their judgment bearing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake off. Whittaker didn't sit down. He adjusted his tie, his expression calm and unwavering. "Sergeant Carter," he said evenly, "would you like to know why I was in that neighborhood that night?" Linda swallowed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. He didn't wait for an answer. "I was following a lead on racial profiling within law enforcement," he continued. "Over the past several months, we received numerous complaints about officers in this district. Officers stopping individuals without cause, making false arrests, and justifying their actions under the vague umbrella of suspicious behavior." He tilted his head slightly. "Sound familiar?" Linda's fingers dug into her lap. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the suffocating pressure of the situation spiraling out of her control. Whittaker took a slow step closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "I wanted to see it firsthand," he said. "So I dressed professionally, walked in a well-lit area, and waited. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't fit any actual suspect description. I was just there." He paused. "And then you stopped me." Linda clenched her jaw, but her silence was deafening. "Tell me, Sergeant," Whittaker continued, Would you have stopped me if I had been a white man in that suit?" A ripple went through the courtroom. The judge gave a warning glance to the audience, but everyone could feel the shift in the air. Linda's pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't say yes, but saying no would be a lie. And everyone in that room knew it. "I was doing my job," she said finally, her voice tight. Whittaker exhaled through his nose. A quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "No, Sergeant," he said. "You were doing what you thought you could get away with." A sharp pain twisted in Linda's gut. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit evidence into the court record," Whittaker said. Judge Grayson nodded. "Proceed." Whittaker handed a thick folder to the court clerk, who took it to the judge. The moment she opened it, her eyebrows rose. "What is this?" she asked. Whittaker clasped his hands behind his back. "A full report of Sergeant Carter's stop and search history over the past 5 years, compiled from department records." He turned slightly, addressing the jury. "In those 5 years, she conducted 312 stops. Of those, 243 were black men. That's 78% of her stops in a city where the black population is 35%. A murmur went through the audience. The judge flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. "And how did you obtain these records, Agent Whittaker?" "As a federal investigator, I have full access to law enforcement case files, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "And what I found was disturbing." Linda clenched her fists under the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. Whittaker continued, his voice unwavering. "In addition to her racial profiling pattern, Sergeant Carter has made 27 arrests where the charges were later dismissed due to lack of probable cause. That means 27 innocent people were taken to jail because she assumed they were criminals." He let that hang in the air. "And yet, here she sits, testifying against me," he said, shaking his head. "But today, she's the one on trial." Linda's breathing became shallow. She could feel her career slipping through her fingers, one word at a time. Judge Grayson looked up from the files, her sharp eyes landing on Linda. "Sergeant Carter," she said, her voice level, "would you like to explain these statistics?" Linda hesitated. What could she say? That it was just coincidence, that it wasn't racial profiling, but intuition. She knew how that would sound, how it already sounded. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. "I was just following my training." The judge let out a slow breath, disappointment flickering in her expression. "I see," she said, setting the folder down. Hayes folded her arms. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, we move to have all charges against my client dropped immediately." The judge didn't hesitate. "Motion granted," she said, banging the gavel. "All charges against Special Agent Whittaker are dismissed." It was official. Linda had lost. She barely registered the murmurs around her as the reality sank in. But then, Whittaker wasn't finished. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I also request that Sergeant Carter's actions be reviewed by the Civil Rights Division for possible federal charges." Linda's breath hitched. "Federal charges?" Judge Grayson nodded. "I will authorize a full review." And just like that, the floor beneath Linda's feet vanished. She sat frozen as the courtroom began to clear out. People whispered, exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Others looked angry. Whittaker turned toward her one last time. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" he asked softly. Linda swallowed. She wanted to snap at him, to defend herself. But she had nothing left to say. He studied her for a moment longer, then simply shook his head and walked away. The judge left the bench. The jury was dismissed. The prosecutor packed up his things and walked out without a word. Even the police officers who had been in the audience, a few of her colleagues, wouldn't meet her eyes as they left. She was alone. Linda exhaled shakily and stood. But as she made her way toward the exit, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass door. For the first time, she saw herself the way others had always seen her. Not as the hero, not as the protector, but as the problem. And the worst part, she had no one to blame but herself. The fall from grace. Sergeant Linda Carter sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room of her own precinct, the one she had worked in for over a decade. But today, she wasn't here as an officer. She wasn't here to question a suspect or prepare a case. She was the one under investigation. The walls felt like they were closing in, the fluorescent light above casting harsh shadows across the metal table where she sat with her hands folded tightly together. Across from her, two men in dark suits watched her with unreadable expressions. One was Agent Ronald DeWitt, a senior investigator from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. A broad-shouldered man with deep lines etched into his face, he carried an air of quiet authority. The other, Captain Jeremy Lawson, was her superior. He had been her boss for years, but today, he wasn't here as an ally. His arms were crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his silence was heavier than any words he could have spoken. Linda swallowed hard. She had never imagined herself in this position. The moment the judge had approved the DOJ's investigation, everything had unraveled faster than she could control. Her entire record was being audited, every stop she had made, every arrest, every report she had ever filed, her suspensions of suspects, her use of force history, her disproportionate number of stops on black men. And as of this morning, she had been officially placed on administrative leave. "You understand why you're here, Sergeant." Agent DeWitt's voice was low and even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Linda forced herself to nod. "Yes." "Then let's not waste time." He flipped open a thick file and pulled out a document. "We've compiled data from your last 5 years of service. Would you care to explain why 78% of your stops were on black men, despite the fact that they only make up 35% of the local population?" Linda felt a sharp pang in her chest. She knew this was coming. She had spent the last few nights lying awake, running through every possible justification. "I followed my training," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I stopped people based on behavior, not race." Agent DeWitt barely blinked. "Behavior." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Explain to me what suspicious behavior looks like, Sergeant Carter." Linda clenched her jaw. "It depends on the situation." DeWitt flipped to another page in the file. "Let's talk about one of those situations." He slid the paper across the table toward her. "A stop you made 8 months ago, March 15th. Do you remember this incident?" Linda hesitated before glancing down. She did recognize the case. She had stopped a young black man in his early 20s, claiming he matched the description of a suspect. "What about it?" she asked. DeWitt's gaze sharpened. "You detained him for over 30 minutes. You searched his backpack, found nothing. And in the end, you let him go, but not before running his name through the system." He paused. "Why?" Linda pressed her lips together. "I was being thorough." DeWitt shook his head. "No, Sergeant. You were looking for something to justify the stop after you had already made it. That's not policing. That's targeting." Linda's stomach twisted. Captain Lawson, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Do you know what happened to that young man, Carter?" Linda frowned. "He was released." Lawson exhaled sharply. 2 months later, he filed a formal complaint, one that got buried before it ever reached Aya. His voice was hard now. "We pulled it out of the system after Whitaker's case went public." Linda's breath caught. "Turns out," Lawson continued, his eyes boring into hers, "he wasn't just some random kid. He was a pre-law student at Howard University. And thanks to that night, he spent the next few months terrified of walking home after work." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "That wasn't my intention." DeWitt's expression was unreadable. "Your intent is irrelevant. What matters is the pattern." He flipped to another document. "Here's another case, 2 years ago. Another stop with no probable cause. Another black man detained and questioned for no legitimate reason." He flipped to another. Here's another, then another, and another. With every page he turned, Linda felt herself sinking deeper. "There's a pattern, Sergeant," DeWitt said coldly. "And you know what the scariest part is?" He leaned in. "You didn't even notice it." The words hit her harder than she expected. Linda wanted to argue. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say that it wasn't like that she had never seen herself as a bad cop. But she couldn't ignore what was in front of her. She stopped. Her mouth was dry. DeWitt let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You had power, Sergeant. Power to determine who walked away and who got thrown into the system. And you used it carelessly." His gaze was piercing now. "You're not on trial for one mistake. You're here because you made hundreds of them. And never questioned yourself once." Linda felt something crack inside her. Captain Lawson sighed, rubbing his temples. "The department has already distanced itself from you. Your badge is suspended, your gun has been turned in, and the chief is not happy about the PR nightmare this has caused." He let the words sink in. "But that's just the beginning." Linda's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" DeWitt sat back. "We are recommending federal charges." The room spun. "Federal." Her voice came out hoarse. "Pattern discrimination," DeWitt said. "Civil rights violations. Abuse of power." Linda felt like she had been punched in the gut. "You'll be facing possible charges," DeWitt continued. "Your cases will be reviewed. And if we find more violations, you could be looking at a trial, a conviction, and possible jail time." Jail. She felt her hands go numb. This wasn't just about losing her job anymore. She could lose everything. "But," DeWitt said, "there is one option." Linda's head snapped up. "What?" He steepled his fingers together. "Cooperation." A pit formed in her stomach. "If you work with us," DeWitt said, "provide names, details, insight into how deep this culture of misconduct runs, we might be able to reduce the charges." Linda's heart pounded. Snitching on other officers, turning against the department that had once been her shield. She glanced at Captain Lawson. His expression was cold, but there was something else in his eyes. He knew what she was thinking. And deep down, she already knew her answer. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one holding the power. She was the one trying to survive. Linda exhaled shakily, and the weight of her past decisions pressed down on her like an avalanche. This was it, her moment of reckoning. And she had no one to blame but herself. The reckoning. Linda Carter's fingers twitched as she clenched them into fists beneath the cold metal table. The weight of what had just been laid before her was suffocating. Federal charges, a possible prison sentence, and the only way out. Betray the system that had protected her for over a decade. She had spent her entire career believing she was the one in control, the one deciding who was guilty, who deserved to be detained, who needed to be questioned. But now, she was the one under scrutiny. And the irony burned. Across from her, Agent DeWitt watched her carefully, waiting for a response. Captain Lawson, her superior, remained silent, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The walls of the interrogation room suddenly felt smaller. "You're telling me," she started, her voice hoarse, "that my only option is to turn on my colleagues." DeWitt didn't blink. "Your only option is to tell the truth, if you have anything worth saying." Linda pressed her lips together. She wanted to argue, to fight back, to claim she was being targeted unfairly, but the files sitting on the table in front of her told a different story. She had stopped hundreds of people for no reason beyond her own bias. She had detained innocent people because she thought they looked suspicious. She had falsified reports, exaggerated resistance claims, and dismissed formal complaints without a second thought. And now, the system that had protected her for so long was ready to throw her away. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a cop standing behind the badge. She was just another person sitting on the other side of the interrogation table. And she was alone. The ticking clock. DeWitt leaned forward. "We have a federal case in motion. The only reason we're sitting here with you now is to see if you want to help yourself before this gets worse." Linda felt her stomach churn. "How much worse?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. DeWitt's expression remained unreadable. "Depends. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll proceed with what we have, which, by the way, is enough to recommend indictment. You'll be looking at a criminal trial, legal fees, and public scrutiny that you are not ready for." Linda swallowed. "If you cooperate," DeWitt continued, "if you provide useful information, real names, real incidents, real patterns, there's a possibility we work out a deal. A lesser charge, maybe even immunity, depending on what you give us." Linda exhaled sharply, glancing toward Captain Lawson, her boss, a man she had once respected, a man who now looked at her like she was already guilty. "Captain," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "do you really think this is fair?" Lawson's jaw tightened. His eyes were cold. "Fair," he repeated. "Carter, do you think the people you falsely arrested thought that was fair?" Linda stiffened. "You stopped innocent men, humiliated them, threw them in holding cells, then walked away like it never happened," Lawson continued, his voice low and sharp. "And now you want to talk about fairness." A heavy silence followed. Linda's pulse pounded in her ears. Lawson had been her ally, her superior, but not anymore. "You don't have a badge right now, Carter," he said. "And from where I'm standing, you might never get it back." The words hit harder than she expected. Her badge, her identity, everything she had built over the years, her entire life, was slipping away, and she had no one to blame but herself. The last chance. DeWitt spoke again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "We're giving you one opportunity," he said. "You want to fight this? You can. But understand, we already have more than enough to bury you, and if we go to trial, this will be national news. Your name will be tied to this forever." Linda clenched her fists. If she fought this, there was a real chance she'd lose. She would become a disgraced ex-cop, spending years in court, hemorrhaging money on legal fees, and possibly ending up in prison. If she cooperated, she might walk away with a lighter sentence, maybe even immunity. But at what cost? She'd have to give them names. She'd have to expose the system she had once protected. She'd have to betray the thin blue line. She exhaled slowly. "This isn't just about me," she murmured, staring down at the table. "No," DeWitt agreed. "It's about all the people who were stopped, harassed, or falsely arrested because officers like you thought they could get away with it." Linda shut her eyes for a brief second. She had spent her whole career thinking she was doing her job, thinking she was right. But was she? Was she really just doing her job? Or had she convinced herself that the power she held made her untouchable? She opened her eyes again. DeWitt and Lawson were watching her closely, waiting. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had made hundreds of decisions throughout her career. Some good, some bad, some that haunted her more now than she ever thought they would. But this decision, this was the only one that mattered. She had to choose. Fight or fold. Linda took a slow, shaky breath. And then, finally, she made her choice. The choice that changed everything. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in around Sergeant Linda Carter as the weight of her decision pressed down on her like an avalanche. She had spent her career standing on one side of the badge, believing in the absolute certainty of her actions. But now she was the one being investigated. Now she was the one looking for a way out. Agent Ronald DeWitt and Captain Jeremy Lawson sat across from her, their expressions unreadable but expectant. They had laid out the choice before her. Fight back and risk losing everything, or cooperate and expose the system she had once sworn to protect. Her fingers tapped against the cold metal table. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had always seen herself as one of the good ones. But what if she wasn't? She licked her lips, her throat dry. "You're asking me to betray my own department." DeWitt leaned forward slightly. "We're asking you to tell the truth." "The truth?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "The truth is, every officer in this precinct, hell, in this country, knows the rules aren't written the same way for everyone. We're taught to follow procedure, but we also know that sometimes it's about who you stop, not what they're actually doing." Captain Lawson exhaled sharply. "And you're just admitting that now?" Linda swallowed hard. "I guess I never thought I'd be on this side of it." DeWitt remained silent, watching her closely. She thought about all the arrests she had made, all the people she had detained over the years, convinced that she was just doing her job. But if it had really been just her job, why had the numbers been so lopsided? Why had she stopped so many black men under the vague reasoning of suspicious behavior, even when they had done nothing wrong? Why had she assumed they were hiding something, even when they had nothing to hide? She had trusted her instincts, and her instincts had led her here. The bargain. DeWitt's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Here's the reality, Sergeant," he said. "If you choose to fight this, you will be indicted. The evidence against you is solid, and once it hits the media, you'll be facing public backlash that you can't even begin to prepare for." Linda clenched her jaw. "And if I cooperate?" DeWitt sat back, folding his hands. "That depends on how much you give us." She glanced at Captain Lawson. His gaze was cold but measured. He was waiting, expecting her to hold the line, to deny everything, to walk out of this room in defiance. But that wasn't an option anymore. Not after everything. "Give me an hour," she said finally. DeWitt lifted an eyebrow. "For what?" "To think." DeWitt considered for a moment, then nodded. "We'll be back in an hour. Choose wisely, Sergeant." He and Captain Lawson stood up, leaving the room without another word. The door shut behind them with a quiet click. Linda exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. She had an hour. 1 hour to decide if she would fight for a broken system or tear it down from the inside. The ghosts of her past. Linda ran a hand through her hair, staring at the table in front of her. The past 10 years of her career flashed through her mind. The first time she stopped a black teenager just because he looked out of place. The first time she was told to let a wealthy white suspect go because his father was connected. The first time she ignored a complaint from a civilian, assuming they were just trying to play the victim. She had chosen not to see the cracks in the system. But now, those cracks were all she could see. She closed her eyes, thinking back to Agent Daniel Whitaker, the man she had arrested under false pretenses, the federal investigator who had been there to catch her in the act. She had assumed he was guilty, assumed he was up to something just because he was walking in a nice neighborhood at night. How many others had she done the same thing to? Her stomach churned. For the first time, she let herself feel the weight of what she had done. The fear, the humiliation, the powerlessness she had made other people feel. And for the first time, she understood. The choice. When the door opened again, an hour had passed. Agent DeWitt and Captain Lawson re-entered the room, both watching her closely as they took their seats. Linda sat up straighter. She had made her decision. DeWitt spoke first. "What's it going to be, Carter?" She took a breath. "And then, I'll talk." A beat of silence passed. Captain Lawson tensed slightly. "Are you sure?" She exhaled. "I don't think I've ever been more sure of anything." DeWitt didn't react right away. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Good. Then let's start from the beginning." Linda felt her hands tremble as she placed them on the table. She was about to burn every bridge she had ever built. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way forward. The first domino falls. Over the next 3 hours, Sergeant Linda Carter talked. She told them about the officers in her precinct who targeted black men more frequently than anyone else. She told them about the unspoken rules, the ones that let white suspects walk free while others were thrown into the system. She told them about the reports that were ignored, the complaints that were buried, the culture that protected dirty cops. And with every name she gave, every story she revealed, the system she had once been loyal to began to crack. The aftermath. By the time she left the interrogation room, she knew there was no going back. She wasn't a cop anymore. She was a witness in a federal case against her own department. A whistleblower. A traitor in the eyes of her former colleagues. And maybe that was exactly what she needed to be. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just following orders. She was doing the right thing. And no badge in the world could give her back what she had lost. She had taken people's freedom. Now, she had to earn her own. The price of redemption. Linda Carter stood at the steps of the courthouse, the weight of her decision still pressing down on her shoulders. The sky above was a dull gray, the air heavy with the tension that had followed her since she left the interrogation room. She had done it. She had given names. She had broken the silence. And now, she was the one being watched. As she stepped down onto the sidewalk, she felt the stares. Cold, judgmental, some even filled with hatred. Other officers, people she had worked alongside for years, stood across the street, their gazes drilling into her like knives. They knew. The department knew. And now, the world would know. A car was waiting for her at the curb, an unmarked black sit-in. Inside, Agent Ronald DeWitt was waiting. He had been the one to leave the interrogation, the one who had given her the choice to either sink or swim. She had chosen to swim, but now she had to live with the consequences. She opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. DeWitt didn't look at her right away. He simply turned the ignition, the engine humming to life before he finally spoke. "It started," he said. Linda took a shaky breath. "How bad is it?" DeWitt let out a short sigh. "They're calling you a traitor, a liar. Some of the guys in your precinct are already talking about how you turned your back on family." Linda exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Of course they were. "They're protecting themselves," she muttered. DeWitt finally glanced at her. "You're not wrong." He shifted gears and pulled away from the curb. "You gave us a lot, Carter. Enough to take down multiple officers, possibly even some high-ranking officials. The DOJ is moving forward with the investigation, and your cooperation will be made public soon." Linda swallowed hard. She knew what that meant. It meant she would never work in law enforcement again. It meant her face would be plastered across news outlets as the officer who exposed her own department. It meant she had no allies left in the force. And yet, despite it all, she didn't regret it. For the first time in years, she had done something that actually felt right. Not just for herself, for the people she had wronged. The fallout. Over the next few weeks, Linda became a name in the headlines. Every major news station ran the story. Whistleblower cop exposes racial bias in Atlanta PD. DOJ opens investigation into unconstitutional policing practices. Former Sergeant Carter cooperates with federal investigation. Multiple officers under review. She had expected anger. What she hadn't expected was the death threats. Every morning, she woke up to her inbox flooded with messages, some from strangers, others from officers she had once called friends. Some messages were simple. "You ruined your career, Carter." Others were more dangerous. "You better watch your back. Snitches don't last long." Her tires were slashed. A brick was thrown through her apartment window. She knew exactly who was behind it, but there was nothing she could do. Filing a police report wouldn't help, not when the people she was exposing were the same ones she would have to call for help. So she stayed quiet. She kept her head down. And she waited. The trial that changed everything. The day the first corrupt officer was arrested, Linda watched the news in silence. Officer Matthew Briggs, one of the cops she had named in her testimony, had been taken into custody on federal charges of civil rights violations and falsifying police reports. It wasn't just one case. It was dozens. The media uncovered body camera footage of Briggs planting evidence. They found reports he had filed against black men who had done nothing wrong, cases that were eerily similar to the one she had built against Agent Daniel Whitaker. Briggs was the first. More names followed. More arrests. The department was imploding. And Linda, she was the one who had lit the match. As she sat in her empty apartment, watching the trial unfold on TV, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, guilt, fear, but above all else, hope. Because for the first time, something was actually changing. The unexpected call. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello. A pause. Then, Sergeant Carter. Linda's breath hitched. She knew that voice. It was Daniel Whitaker, the man she had falsely arrested, the federal agent who had exposed her. She swallowed hard. Agent Whitaker. Silence. Then, I heard you're out. Linda exhaled slowly. Yeah, I guess I am. Another pause. Then, to her surprise, Whitaker's voice softened. You did the right thing, Carter. Linda closed her eyes. Doesn't feel like it. It will. A beat of silence passed between them. Then Whitaker said something that caught her off guard. You ever thought about what comes next? Linda frowned. What do you mean? You're done with the department, he said. You're never getting your badge back. And whether you like it or not, you're in the spotlight now. Linda's fingers tightened around her phone. Yeah. So maybe, Whitaker continued, it's time to start using your voice for something good. Linda frowned. Like what? Whitaker let out a small chuckle. That's up to you. But if you ever want to be on the right side of this fight, give me a call. She didn't know how to respond. Whitaker didn't press. Take care of yourself, Carter, he said. Then the line went dead. Linda slowly lowered the phone, staring at it in silence. The right side of this fight. She had spent her whole career thinking she was already there. But maybe she had been fighting the wrong battle all along. She exhaled, glancing toward her window. The city lights flickered in the distance. A new beginning. A chance to actually make things right. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth everything she had lost.